All right, we are at the top of the hour, so let's go ahead and dive into this subject. This is a relatively short subject, but it's one that I've gotten a lot of use out of over the years. So I wanted to share it with everyone in Chingu. Basically, what we're going to talk about is, what is flow of control and what's an option for altering the flow of control in a program without using a conditional. So what is flow of control? That's really the first question. It's the order of execution of the instructions that you've coded in your program. Um, so flow of control coupled with conditionals, it's what causes a different path, a different sequence of instructions to be executed based upon the value of constants and variables. And this is what really brings the power to any type of application is being able to alter its execution at runtime based upon data that the user provides. And essentially, you can think of it as nonlinear execution. Flow of control gives you that option. You don't have to code everything in sequence. Again, you can use conditionals to alter the flow of control based upon the data that your application has received. So let's look at some examples, of flow of control statements, the conditionals. There's the if statement and the if else, and this is specific to JavaScript. In other languages, there may be other variants of these, but that if and if else, they allow you to check the value of again, a variable or a constant, and then to take some action based upon what that value is. There's a switch statement, which in languages like C, it's known as the case statement, but it allows you to essentially, based upon the value of a constant or variable, do the same thing. You can execute a set of instructions unique to that value. And we'll see examples in a few minutes of each of these, so you can see how they compare to one another. And essentially, all three of these or four of these, including the ternary, they're all variations of if and if else. So a ternary, it's just a shorthand. It's really the same as an if else. It basically says that actually this is coded incorrectly. If x is equal to y, oops. If x is equal to y, this should let you assign a constant of 4 to x or return a null. And this is incorrectly coded. What it should say is let x equal y. So I apologize for this syntax error. So let's see some examples. If we have let's say a series of database or a database table with rows in it, we could use an if else statement to basically do some special action based upon what each user's country is. So in this case, we check if the country is Australia, we'll call a function add to Australia. If it's Ecuador, we'll do the same, but for Ecuador, and so on. And then if we don't get any match, then the final else statement will throw an error. So does this make sense? Is this clear right now? Cool, thank you. There is a particular kind of code smell around this, though. This is not too bad. This is fairly readable if you're only dealing with 4 countries. But I think there's almost 200 countries on the planet Earth. So if we were to code an if else and compare all 200 country names, this could get really unmanageable, you know. And that's a problem with these nested ifs like this. They become hard to read and it becomes hard to manage. So imagine that if we have 200 of these if else statements, and then two countries merge with one another. You know, it doesn't happen often, but it does happen. Countries divide and countries merge. Well, just imagine the effort it would take to try to find, you know, where is that country, that original country in this list, and you know, how do we modify it for the new country? Or if a country was absorbed by another country, you know, it'd be the same problem. Well, plus, you know, just having an if that's 200 or more lines long, again, it's just really difficult to read. So let's look at a switch statement. Now, a switch statement is just, it really is an if statement, but it has some different syntax to try to improve readability. So in this case, we're saying we want to switch comparing the value of the variable country to particular cases, particular instances. So instead of saying if country equal Australia, we've coded this more empirically, where you know we're saying, okay, based on the variable country, if we have a case where the value is Australia, do this. Call the add to Australia function. If it's Ecuador, you know, call the add to Ecuador. If it's India, call the add to India, and so on. And again, this has the same problems of a larger if statement. You know, it's not bad if you've got, you know, 2 to 10 situations or cases. But if you had 200 different cases, this gets, again, it's hard to read and it's hard to manage. And then the final one is the worst one of all, is the ternary statement. So I have to kind of explain here. I use ternary statements all the time, but I don't nest ternaries. And again, you can follow whatever practice you feel suits your needs. But for me, I found it better that if I have an if-else type of situation where there's some nesting, I have multiple if conditions, then rather than using a ternary, I will use a regular if-else statement or a switch statement. And you can see the reason why is ternary is just a shorthand for if. It says, I want to assign, I want to make an assignment to this result if the country is Australia. I want to do the add to Australia. If it's not, that's what the colon says. It's the not. If it's not Australia, I want to see if the country is Ecuador. And it's essentially a nested ternary, and so on. And just like the previous two examples, imagine what happens if this becomes 200 cases that you have to examine, 200 different conditionals. Again, it's harder to read, I think, than an if or a switch when you get that kind of volume. And again, because it's hard to read, that means it's hard to maintain. So any questions about if, switch, or ternary? You know, we're really just setting the stage for an alternative to using these that helps reduce the amount of code to make it more maintainable and actually more extensible as well, easier to extend. So let me ask a question. Is everyone here familiar with not just the if, but the switch and the ternary statement in JavaScript? Oh, here comes Dave. Good, welcome, Dave. So yeah, I think almost everyone is familiar with the if. You may or may not have used the switch or the ternary, but those are alternatives to the if statement as well. So let's take a look or set the stage for how to do this a different way, how to do routing a flow of control without, uh, without using conditionals. So before we even start, we have to talk about what a reference is in JavaScript. So for objects, arrays, and functions, they are stored by reference. And you can think of a reference as really being the same as the address of that object, array, or function in the memory of your computer or the memory of your server. And so what happens is when you assign an object to a variable, or you pass a function in or an object as a parameter to a function, what's passed isn't the value. It's actually the reference. It's the address of where the object, array, or function is in memory. And what this means is that if I assign an object to a variable, for example, that variable plus the object occupy the same, they have the same address in memory. So the variable becomes a reference to the object or a reference to the array. And if we look at an example of this, let's say that we have a function, get country, and we have a variable or a constant where we said country function is equal to get country. Well, what does this do? Well, in memory, our get country function occupies a particular range of addresses in memory. Well, when we do this assignment, we say get country or country function is equal to get country. All that does is that assigns that a reference to this location in memory to country function. So it's basically both of these, both our function and this constant are pointing to the same location in memory. And that's why we call this, or this is called a reference, because it's referencing memory. So any questions? This is all going to make sense in a minute. We're going to show how to use references to do conditional routing without using if, switch, or ternaries. So let's look at a better way of doing control of flow using JSON. And I say JSON. I'll use JSON and JavaScript objects, arrays of JavaScript objects synonymously. So again, let's say we have this database table we've read into memory. Each row is for a user, and it contains basically the country that user lives in. Well, we could translate this into a JavaScript object or a JSON where basically we have the ID, the name, and the country. We have the column values for each row, but we've added two additional attributes to this object. Handler, which is a reference to the add to Ecuador function in this case, and then an indicator, parms, just indicates, hey, does the add to Ecuador accept any parameters or not? So Ecuador becomes the selection criteria, just as it was in the if, the switch, or the ternary. And add to Ecuador is a reference to a particular function. So if we were to add, Dinesh's entry to this particular array of objects, his entry would have a country of India. I would have a handler of add to India. And then Ruben would be, country would be Norway, and it would be add to Norway. So we basically have an array that maps our users, our data, to a particular function that needs to be executed for that user. So we could read this table in and then loop over the entries to call this function. And it wouldn't take an if statement. Now, the question now is, this is great. We've showed you the data. How do you do this in code? So let's switch over to Visual Studio Code and we'll show an example. And we'll also go through some pitfalls of what to watch out for. So in this is a pretty simple application. In package.json, you can see I've only got two dependencies. I'm using a library called Chalk to add color to my console logs. And I'm using prompt sync, which is a library that lets me read values from the console. So rather than creating a React app, I kept this really simple. This is just a Node.js application. So one of the first things that happens is after my import, you can see on line 5, I said, I don't want to call prompt sync. I want to assign it a shorter name. So this is an example where I've created a constant that is a reference to the prompt sync function that I imported from the prompt sync library. And when I use it, let's look at an example here. Oh, here, right here. You can see prompt. I'm prompting the console or the terminal for input from the user. So let's look next at what data is this using? Basically from line 24 on down, what I'm doing is I'm looping over this route array of route objects. And I've given them a name and a description. You'll note that I've imported a function, in this case, like current date and convert to local date. These are just JavaScript functions. So I've imported them so I can assign the reference to each of these functions in the handler. And then I've got this dynamic params, which tells me the code, rather, shouldn't say me, but the code. Do I need to pass any parameters to these functions when I invoke them? So if we go back to index.js, let's kind of step through this. What I'm doing is, well, let's just execute this actually. Let me make this a little larger. So what this is doing, it's prompting the user. It's saying, hey, here's two functions you could execute. I'm just going to say function 1 because it's the easiest. So it echoes back. It tells me that, hey, this is the function you selected. And then what it does is it actually calls that function. Since I selected current date, it's calling the current date function. But instead of using current date, what it's doing is it's using the the value of selected function from the routes table, or it's using the handler attribute, I should say. If I go back, we can see that selected function is assigned the value of whatever the handler attribute was in the routes, in the appropriate routes row from this array. In this case, it was current date. So does that make sense? If it doesn't, by all means, tell me. We're here to answer questions and to try to make this a little clear. In the slide deck, I put the deck in the pound announcements channel, or the, I'm sorry, uh, the uh, uh, Roundtable channel, uh, the town hall chat channel. Um, at the end of it, there is a link to the repo that contains this code, so you can see it in GitHub. So let's look at the second piece of this. Let's look at the second function because it accepts a parameter. So the question becomes, how do you dynamically pass a parameter to a function? You know, it's easy if I were calling, like in this case, I'm calling chalk.white, you know, or console.log. You know, I know what parameters. I just hard coded the parameters in my program. But in the case where I'm calling a function by its using a reference, how do I pass the parameters to it? Well, the first thing I've done is I've said if this particular function, if its dynamic params attribute from the routes.js, if it's true, then that tells me I know I have to pass some parameters. And so if this is true, what I'm doing is I'm prompting the user for the date that they want to convert, and I'm adding that to I'm converting it to a date object and assigning it to the params constant. And then what I do is I'm using this apply function to pass the parameter to selected function. And we'll talk in a minute about this apply function, but it basically it has two purposes. It allows you to specifically set the value of this, and it also allows you to specify the parameters you want the function to be called with. So let's execute this and just kind of see what it looks like. So in this case, I'm going to do npm run start again. And I'm going to select option number 2. And I want to do 2025. I'll give it today's date, which is the 16th. And I think I have a problem in the way my locale is set on this computer because it's obviously it's calculating the wrong date. It's a date, the 15th instead of the 16th is what's coming back. But what it did is it called convert to local date, this function, passing it that date parameter that we defined back in our index.js code. And it did it through this apply function. So let's see. Dave said, is this the declarative style pattern? I've seen this type of thing before at work. You know, Dave, to be honest, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if this is the formal definition of the declarative pattern or not. It is a declarative solution, though, to the problem of, you know, how do you call a function or know what function to call without using a conditional? Now, you'll also know, we're going to go back and talk about apply in just a second. I've got a slide for that. But one of the things to be careful of when you're using this type of solution is remember that JavaScript is a non-typed language. Okay, it's not like C++ or Java, which are strongly typed. You know, JavaScript is at best, it's loosely typed. Well, because of that, and because I'm dynamically, you know, setting the value of this selected function constant or variable up here, what I need to do is before I invoke it, I need to make sure that it's really a function. So to do that, I've got this, I'm checking the type of the selected function variable to make sure it is a function. And if it's not, then I'll issue an error. And so this is a way of coding what we call a defensive code pattern to basically make sure that the type of the data is what I'm expecting in the code, because I don't want any unforeseen errors to pop up. So let's just do that real quick. Let's change the value of, let's do selected function equals 0. And let's run this again. So now we'll do, and you can see we got an error. You know, basically we threw this error, or we basically issued this error message and then exited our code uh, at line 41. So, I'm sorry. You know what? This is misplaced. Let's move this. I like it when problems happen. I think they're more instructive in these kind of situations. So let's move that code up here so that it's executed for each of our two different situations. The situations being a function requires a parameter or it doesn't require a parameter. So let's save this. We'll run this again. Oh, and that's what we expected. We can see because selected function, this variable doesn't have a type of function, our code has intercepted that and given us an error message. So any questions on the code part of this? I hope this makes sense. And you can see that what happens is this if statement, if dynamic params is false, meaning that the function doesn't require any parameters, then it's going to take the else branch of the if. It's just going to call selected function with no parameters. Okay, let's just very quickly go back to the deck. There's the link. Oh, I thought I had a slide for apply, but I guess I don't. That's my bad. Once again, the apply function, what it does is it allows you to set the value of this. So you can explicitly set the context of the this variable that's built into JavaScript. And you can also set the parameter or define the parameters that you want to be passed to selected function. It's basically params, in this case, becomes an array of parameters. So I don't care about the value of this. So I've just said this is null. I don't have a context I want to set, but I do want to set the parameters. Now, there's another way you could have called this. You could have called it with a spread parameter or a spread object and or spread statement, I should say. And that is another way you could assign parameters to it. Yeah, and that's exactly what's happening, Dave. You're right. We are abstracting out the conditionals so that basically, let's say we had 200 options here rather than just two, rather than having an if-else that's 200 levels deep, or a switch statement with 200 cases, or a horrible ternary that has 200 that's nested 200 levels. Basically, we have what amounts to line 34 to line 48. We have about 14 lines of code that does the same thing. Now, there is a better way of doing the example that I showed in the slide deck too. If I were implementing this, to get this JSON, that means I would have had to translate the data from my database into a JSON. And since this is an array, if I had 100,000, let's say, customers, I'd have a JSON with 100,000 rows in it, and that would be bad. It would take too much memory. It takes too much time to process. A better way to do this would be to create a JSON that just maps the country to the handler and the params and take out the ID and the name. That way, if you've got 200 countries, you might still have 200 entries in this, but it would be 200 entries versus the 100,000 in your rows in your database. So that's actually all I wanted to cover today. Uh, I want to open this up though to any questions you have. If there's something that wasn't clear and you want me to go back over it, well, absolutely, I'm happy to do that. Or if you have a question about anything else, something about Chingu or voyages or solo projects, we'll take any and all questions or comments. And I have a question. Was this helpful at all? Was this something new to you, or is this something you've seen before?
Well, I'd like to say it's not exactly the first time I'm meeting this, but it's not something you see every day. Everyone is used to if statements and ternaries. Switch cases come, once in a while even, but and this is very good. It helps really with the maintainability. Yeah, that's one thing I like about it.
Yeah, that's a good point. And like I said, this has a specific use case, and that use case is when you have uh, attributes in your data that require uh, unique blocks of logic to be executed, and there are many different of those conditions. That's where this really applies best. So let's see. Regina said, "How did you get your console prompt to be colorful?" Uh, yeah, and Obobo that's absolutely correct. There's a library I'm using. Let me make this a little so you can see. I'm using a library called Chalk, and what Chalk allows me to do, if you see this, let's look at line 9. I can pass it or invoke a Chalk function to turn this text green or white or blue or whatever. It has a number of color options. And then the way that I got the input through the console from the end user is I use this prompt sync library. And this is, you don't have to do this. This is something that I do. I write a lot of console, like Node.js CLI commands, and I just have found it nice. I like to color code the input and the output differently, so it's very clear to whoever's running the CLI program that of what the data looks like. Let's see. Dave said, I've seen this pattern of JSON arrays that basically declare how to do things uh, with each of the JSON objects in the array. Then there is some kind of function that consumes the JSON and the internal workings of the function are hidden. JSON is almost like a mini programming language in and of itself. Yeah, that's true. Like OCaml as well is actually OCaml is a programming language, but yeah, JSON has a lot of power. Uh, it is declarative and it is data. It's not really a programming language, but because you can have attributes that are references to functions, again, you can use it to alter the control of flow and do things, a little bit more dynamically. I used this in some code. I used the concept, I should say. It was actually an assembly program. It was an event handler. It was actually a database management system, and based upon different events, it would look up that event in a table to determine what what function needed to be called to handle that event. And that's something that might apply to, if you're writing any type of front end application, a button click, or, click on a particular button, uh, a input into an input field, that type of thing. We're changing focus. You might want a different handler invoked to process those kind of events. And again, the caution here is that because JavaScript is so loosely typed, if you're doing something like this, you want to really make sure that you're validating your uh, your attributes. You're making sure they have the correct type, before you call a handler like this. Another thing you might choose to do is you might have a file that you import that contains your variables so that instead of having just dynamic parameters false or true, you have a reference to that parameter in memory. And so in the case of index.js, what we would have done, we would have set the value of this parameter, uh, but we would have coded params essentially in this JSON and had a reference to it. Yeah, TypeScript is definitely TypeScript has a place. There's been a lot of I shouldn't say a lot. I've seen several articles, both from Chingu as well as other authors out on the web who were throwing a little shade at TypeScript. But I think TypeScript has its place. Uh, I really wish myself, my personal wish list is I wish that TC39 would add typing to JavaScript. But the problem with that is there's so much legacy code out there that that would be really difficult to pull that off. So any other questions or comments, anything at all? I really appreciate the comments that you've had and the questions you've asked. Okay, if there's nothing else to discuss, we're going to close this one out. Um, if you have suggestions for roundtables, open up a ticket in the open support ticket channel in Discord and let us know of any topics you'd like to see in future roundtables. I'm thinking this week, coming week, I think I'm going to do a roundtable on DNS. Um, I've been doing a fair bit of DNS work the past couple days for Chingu, and I think that might be something that might be useful to Chingu's. So we'll see. So in any event, thank you. I appreciate your contributions today, and have a great weekend. And we'll talk to you all later. Bye bye.